Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Marx Labor Power Working Class by Tronti. The particularity of the commodity labor power is the title of the chapter. Did I say it's chapter 5? I'm spacing out, man. Need to get it together. Alright, let's rock. In his effort to grasp the process by which money is transformed into capital, Marx stops at one point and says, quote, "We have to consider more closely that peculiar commodity that is labor power," end quote. In the decisive section on the, quote, "purchase and sale of labor power," end quote, which concludes the second section of Volume 1 of Capital, we find a note which refers, not by chance, to both Ricardo and Hegel. Marx says that the change in the value of money, and thus money's transformation into capital, cannot take place within money itself. Rather, it has to take place within the commodity, not in value, but in use value, and thus in the consumption of a commodity which is exchanged for money. Ricardo had said already on this point that, quote, "in the form of money, capital does not produce profit," end quote. Ricardo. Marx says that the sale of the commodity labor power cannot take place in block and once and for all. Rather, the sale of the commodity labor power must always and only take place for a determinate time. She who possesses this commodity concedes the temporary consumption of her labor power, but not ownership over it. Otherwise, she would no longer be free but a slave. Hegel had already said that, quote, "single products of my particular physical and mental skill and of my power to act I can alienate to someone else, and I can give him the use of my abilities for a restricted period, because on the strength of this restriction my abilities acquire an external relation to the totality and universality of my being. By alienating the whole of my time, as crystallized in my work and everything I produced, I would be making into another's property the substance of my being, my universal activity and actuality, my personality," end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of Right. Money is not capital and does not become capital, but must transform into capital. If this transformation takes place in the commodity, the use value of this commodity must possess a particular quality, namely, that it is itself a source of value. Its real consumption must itself be an objectification of labor and thus a creation of value. And there is already a specific commodity of this type on the market, the capacity to labor power. Quote, "We mean by labor power or labor capacity the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, capacities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind," end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. The presence of labor power on the market presupposes the existence of the seller of labor power. The seller presupposes the proprietor, and the proprietor's sale of labor power presupposes the free ownership of the commodity. And this, too, is a wholly particular freedom, the freedom to sell a single commodity, which is also the impossibility of not selling that commodity, a freely accepted constraint, which is indeed the freedom at the foundation of capital. In this sense, we would more rightly say that the first condition, from which stem all the other conditions that make the transformation of money into capital possible, is the existence of the historically determinate figure of the free worker, who is, quote, "free in the double sense that as a free individual he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, and that, on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale, i.e. is free of all the objects needed for the realization (Verwirklichung) of his labor power," end quote. If labor power is a commodity, then labor power has a value like all other commodities. For the same reason that we could not speak of the, quote, "value of labor," end quote, we can instead speak of the value, quote, of labor, the quote value of labor power, end quote. Labor is not a commodity, it is only the use value of a commodity, in particular the commodity labor power, and a use value has no value as such, only as an exchange value. Labor power as a commodity has an exchange value and a use value. There is nothing peculiar about labor power's exchange value. Like that of any other commodity, labor power is determined by the labor time necessary for labor power's production, which then breaks down into the production of the means of subsistence necessary for the conservation and thus for the reproduction of the possessor of labor power. The formal particularity of labor power as a commodity is concealed within its use value. In the meantime, remaining within the sphere of circulation, we see the peculiar nature of this specific commodity in the fact that when the contract is concluded between buyer and seller, its use value has not yet really passed into the hands of the buyer. The value of this commodity, like the value of any other, is already determined at the point at which it enters into circulation. But unlike in the case of other commodities' use values, its use value is not already objectively contained in its very existence. Rather, the use value comes only afterward, as the subjective unfolding of a possibility, a capacity, a potentiality. The sale of labor power, and thus labor power's existence as an exchange value, and the consumption of labor power, and thus labor power's existence as a use value, are staggered over time. In this case, as in other similar cases, money functions as a means of payment, and the commodity is paid for not at the moment of sale, but after it has been consumed. Quote, in every country where the capitalist mode of production prevails, it is the custom not to pay for labor power until labor power has been exercised for the period fixed by the contract. For example, at the end of each week. In all cases, therefore, the worker advances the use value of his labor power to the capitalist. The worker lets the buyer consume his labor power before the worker receives payment of the price. Everywhere the worker allows credit to the capitalist, end quote. Capital Volume 1. But this is, so to speak, a reflected particularity of labor power's use value. To understand this, we need to connect back to this commodity's original particularity, which comes to light only within the inner workings of the production process, specifically in one part of it, the valorization process proper, the process of the production of surplus value and thus of capital. Marx's conception of surplus value has always been connected back to the classical theory of value. But it would instead rightly be connected back to Marx's own conception of labor power, in the moment in which it meets the concept of productive labor. Only this makes possible an independent treatment of surplus value, in surplus value's general form, before and above any of surplus value's particular forms, such as profit, interest, annuities, and so on. And this is, indeed, the other fundamental discovery in capital, Marx's capital. The use of labor power, Marx tells us, is labor itself. To consume labor power, whoever has bought labor power must make whoever sold labor power work. This consumption process is at the same time a production process, producing commodities and surplus value. And it is within this process that the seller of labor power becomes, in Act 2, what she previously was, only in potential. She becomes labor power in action, transforming into a worker. The value of labor power is then equitably paid in the form of a wage. The worker becomes a wage worker. But what had already been contracted before is only paid in wages after. The form of the wage does not specify the figure of the worker in any way that was not already contained within the figure of the seller of labor power. In the consumption of labor power, in labor, that what is added is the concrete act of production, with indeterminate conditions in the valorization process. It is at this point that the specific use value of the commodity labor power comes out. The commodity labor power's wholly specific nature, the commodity labor power's historical particularity, the commodity labor, not that it is a source of value, as in the particularity of the exchange value of labor power. Rather, it is the particularity of being the source of greater value than it itself has. In the commodity labor power, value does not coincide with valorization. Not only that, but labor power is the sole commodity that through the process of labor power's consumption produces a valorization greater than its own. It produces surplus value, produces capital. Labor power is not, therefore, just potential labor, but also potential capital. The use of labor power is not only labor, but also surplus labor, not only the production of value, but also the production of surplus value. The use of labor power, therefore, is not only labor, but also capital. Yet the use of labor power is inseparable from the complete figure of the worker turned producer. Just as the relation between two antagonistic classes is already contained within the act of sale and purchase of labor power, the relation that founds the entire successive history of capital proper, so too is the entire terrain of the direct struggle between the two classes already prepared within the process of the consumption of labor power at the moment of production, and it is this struggle that will determine the birth, development, and collapse of capitalist society one after the other. Indeed, this is the manner in which the process of capital production first ought to be considered from the working class perspective, that is, as the natural home of the expression of its own antagonism, as the specific terrain of class struggle. Labor power, we have seen, is introduced and must be introduced into the production process as a class and as an antagonistic class. However, as a social productive force, it can not only produce capital, but also belong to capital, becoming an internal part of it. The process of capitalist production thus presents itself as the process of the capitalist appropriation of workers' labor power. It is no longer simply the purchase of that commodity, but the reduction of this commodity's particular nature under its own dominion, no longer the individual act of exchange, but a process of social violence, not only exploitation, but control over exploitation. The consumption and production of the commodity labor power, the productive use of the worker by the capitalist, thus must become the capitalist use of the working class. We must look within this process to unearth the historical birth of a class of capitalists. The capitalist use of the workers as a class is not possible without the capitalists constituting themselves into a class, and their model cannot be but that of the only class hitherto constituted, the class of workers. From this, then, begins the whole history of the movements of the class of workers. But the both logical and historical passage from the proletariat, which sells the proletariat's labor power, to the working class, which produces surplus value, marks the beginning of the working class history of capital, which is then the history of capitalist society proper, as well as the only materialist conception of, quote, history, thus far acceptable from a Marxist point of view. We will return to this. For now, what concerns us is to conclude the point that we had left hanging, namely that the character, the particularity of the commodity labor power is that it is, potentially, the working class. This particular use value is workers in general, what Marx calls, quote, this peculiar breed of commodity owners, unquote. The realized value of labor power in the form of the wage is once again capital, part of capital, as variable capital. This point, however, cannot be the site of the working class specificity of this commodity, since this is not where capital is born. The whole particularity of the commodity labor power lies not in the commodity labor power's value, but in the commodity labor power's use value. For it is the commodity labor power's use value that produces surplus value. It is the use of labor power, labor, that presupposes surplus value, and not surplus labor in general, but the worker's surplus value. Like labor, the use of labor power and the worker's labor, the concrete explication, the concretization of abstract labor which, in turn, already reduced to a commodity, realizes that abstract labor's value in the wage. Thus, the point at which abstract labor flips into the concrete figure of the worker is the process of the consumption of labor power, the moment in which labor power becomes in actuality what labor power had earlier been in potential. It is the point of the realization of the labor power's use value. What had been a simple elementary and general class relation within the act of purchase and sale now definitively acquires its specific character, its total and complex nature. The particularity of labor power, as compared to all the other commodities, thus coincides with the specifically working class character that the process of capital production assumes. Within this, it also coincides with the concretization of a working class initiative in class relations, which leads to a leap in the development of the working class and to the subsequent birth of a class of capitalists. All this is definitively expounded in the first exposition Marx provides of the transformation of money into capital, the 1858 text to his contribution to the critique of political economy. Qua the result of simple circulation, capital exists first in the simple form of money. Capital's existence in money is, rather, only its existence as an adequate exchange value, which can convert into all kinds of commodities indifferently. It is exchange value made autonomous. And this autonomization consists precisely this: the fact that the exchange value remains limited to itself as an exchange value, be it in the form of money or in the form of a commodity. It transforms into a commodity only in order to valorize itself. Money is simply a form of capital insofar as money is now objectified labor. None of labor's objective modes of existence are counterposed to this capital, but all of labor's objective modes of existence present themselves as its possible mode of existence. Quote, the only opposite of reified labor is unreified labor, and the opposite of objectified labor, subjective labor, or the opposite of past labor, which exists in space, is living labor, which exists in time. As the presently existing unreified, and so also not yet objectified labor, it can be present only as the power, potentiality, ability, as the labor capacity of the living subject. The opposite of capital is the independent, firmly self-sufficient, objectified labor, is living labor capacity itself. And so the only exchange by means of which money can become capital is the exchange between the possessor of capital and the possessor of the living labor capacity, the worker, end quote. Marx Engels Collected Works. In money, exchange value had to maintain exchange value's independence, that is, in abstraction from use value. Yet now exchange value, precisely in exchange value's real and not formal existence as a use value, has to maintain itself as an exchange value, and not only maintain itself as the exchange value within use value, but produce itself on this basis. Quote, the real being of use values is their negation, their absorption, their annihilation and consumption, end quote. Marx Engels Collected Works. The true reality of exchange value is no longer in the abstraction from use value. The true reality of exchange value is no longer in the abstraction from use value, but precisely in the consumption of use value. Quote, the real negation of use value which exists not in an abstraction from it, not in a stoppage tensely opposed to it, but in its consumption. This real negation of it, which is at the same time its actualization as use value, must for that reason become an act of self-assertion, self-actualization of exchange value, unquote. Marx Engels Collected Works. Yet this is possible only insofar as the commodity is consumed by labor, and its very consumption presents itself as an objectification of labor, and thus as a creation of value. Quote, for money, use value is now no longer an article of consumption in which it loses itself, but only a use value through which it preserves and increases itself. No other use value exists for money as capital. That is precisely the relation of capital as exchange value to use value. Labor is the only use value which can present an opposition and a complement. Bracket Gegensatz und Ergänzung in bracket to money as capital, and it exists in labor capacity which exists as a subject. Money exists as capital only in connection with non-capital, the negation of capital, bracket nicht Kapital in bracket, the negation of capital, in relation to which alone it is capital. Labor itself is the real non-capital, end quote. Marx Engels Collected Works. Standing counterposed to exchange value in the form of money is exchange value in the form of a particular use value. That is, exchange value can be realized as such only because exchange value is counterposed not to this or that use value, but to the particular use value that concerns it. The particular use value which concerns exchange value, even while being its negation, is labor. In simple circulation, the content of the use value was a matter of indifference and fell outside of the economic relation. Here, conversely, is its essential moment. But the specific use value of at least one of the commodities being exchanged itself leads outside of the confines of simple circulation. It is not the particular form of exchange that provokes this shift. For insofar as there is an exchange of equivalents, here all the sacred rights of freedom and equality are respected. Rather, what provokes it is the particular content of the use value of the commodity labor power. Again, meaning labor. But the, quote, exchange between capital and labor, once it itself exists as the simple relationship of circulation, is not the exchange between money and labor, but the exchange between money and living labor capacity, unquote. As a use value, labor power is realized in working activity itself, but this working activity falls outside of the circulation process. It is true that, quote, the buying of the labor capacity, bracket, is, and bracket, the appropriation of the ability to dispose over the labor, end quote. But this available labor can be consumed only within production. The consumption of labor power is the production of capital. Indeed, within the commodity labor power, the great vital contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction between production and consumption, is resolved. For the consumption of this commodity is nothing other than the productive consumption of this commodity's use value. Thus, the secret of capital lies not in the value, but in the use value of labor power. Quote, it is only the specific nature of the use value bought with the money, namely that its consumption, the consumption of the labor capacity, is production. Labor time which objectifies consumption which posits exchange value, that its real being as use value is creation of exchange value, that makes the exchange between money and labor the specific exchange. money, commodity, money, in which the exchange value itself is posited as the aim of the exchange, and the bought use value is immediate use value for the exchange value, i.e., is value positing use value. End quote. Marx. The use value that produces value is the labor that produces surplus value. Indeed, on the following page, where the manuscript is interrupted by Marx's first exposition of the passage to capital, we find the title, quote, productive and unproductive labor, end quote. And that's the end of chapter 5 of Mario Tronti's Workers and Capital. Sorry, not Workers and Capital. It's in the book. It's this book is within a book. It's chapter 5, The Particularity of the Commodity Labor Power of Marx Labor Power Working Class by Mario Tronti. Thank you so much for listening.